Estamos ao vivo?
Are we live? Hello, good morning to everyone. Welcome to the second year of our research on climate perception in Brazil. This is our third year, and we will discuss the meaning of this survey and its results. I am Pablo Steibel, Executive Director of IPEC, the Institute for Technology and Society, leading the research. We have with us people who were involved with our survey. I will introduce them shortly, but before I would like to explain you the reason for this research. It's not a research or a survey about politics or political expectations. It's specifically about climate change. The idea of ITS and IPEC and the Institute for Research and Society is thinking about data that enable us to think about the agenda in Brazil and what the population is thinking about it. We recently launched a course on gender and climate, which is very interesting. We will display the link for it in short. And all the information that's given here is open or public. We have already launched the data. We launched a program for 8 beneficiaries in our program, and we receive many requests from people who want to use the material along the year. Any questions you have about the process and other information on the research, please contact us later. I will mention the 4 special points about this survey, and then I will give the floor to our other speakers. Number 1, this is the second year when we noticed that people, the Brazilian population, is very interested in global warming and climate change. 9 to 10% of the population is very concerned. This is a very high number, and it also appears in other surveys where the Brazilian population is said to believe and be very worried about climate change. About the left wing politics, the agenda makes it clear that there is no political difference, a very small difference, but you can think that out of 10, at least 3 or 4 people are very much concerned with climate, but they are not a left-wing people who tend to the left wing. They are the population in general. The second point is that I will introduce people who will be with us. First of all, Rosendo, member of IPEC, which is the institution that ensures the quality and seriousness of our survey. It was a challenge to perform it during the COVID period. Rosie will describe this, but it's important to have a more robust vision of the data and what we can state or not state in statistic terms. Then we will hear Sergio Abrantes, who will describe the historical and political context for our survey. We are in a year of elections. It's still not clear which politicians will focus more on climate, but our survey tells us that there's a big concern about climate. It's a big topic. Second, there is an expectation that politicians also focus on that. And third, there might be a chance to discuss that in spite of so much discussion and that climate is not among the 3 top topics. When we think about events such as the Petropolis floods recently or the oil industry, they are related to climate, and Sergio will explain. And finally, we have Anthony Lazarowicz, who will describe the international perspective. He speaks directly from Yale University, the IPCC, and the expectation of comparing Brazil with other countries. And finally, the survey was done collectively, jointly with the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. This is something that Anthony and the university have been working on for over 10 years. It will be very interesting to hear their perspective. So beginning with Rosie, she is the Intelligence and Insights director for IPEC. We will entertain questions, and after each presentation, we will open some time for Q&A. Rosie, you have the floor. Good morning. Let me share my slides, and we will begin our conversation. I hope you can see my screen. Slide mode, presentation mode, good. Well, I believe it's okay. Good morning to all, ladies and gentlemen. As Fabio said, my presentation is on the main results of the survey, beginning with some technical observations. The purpose of the research, as Fabio said, was to raise data on the Brazilian population's perspective about issues regarding the environment and climate change. Collection period was 28 September to November 1st, 2021, 2,600 interviews in a quantitative research performed over the phone. 2 percentage points is the error margin, and considering the sample that was used, it is usually ideal to perform approaches with a greater coverage and penetration. So the first version of this research happened during the first year of the pandemic. At that period, we were forced to find alternative forms of accessing the population and overcoming the sanitary measures. So we only performed epidemiological and physical interviews, and in that case, we adopted the methodology of phone interviews so that we could reach out to most of the population in our sample, to have a representative sample in terms of age, gender, etc., for our sample profile. Now, beginning on the topic of the research itself, and since it was a poll about knowledge, information, standpoint, attitudes, etc., it is important to know how the population obtained their information in general. And what we could see was that the traditional information media are used by the population. By traditional, I mean TV, newspapers, printed papers, radio, and the digital media have been growing, but in 2021, as well as in 2020, we noticed that most of the population gets their information from talks, conversations with their relatives, friends, work colleagues. They also exchange a lot of information on social media. So this indicator helps us to understand the type of information and the main formats that the population seeks. About global knowledge, we can observe the following. While 8 out of 10 people believe global warming is a very important topic, when we discuss knowledge about the topic, only 20% declare they know about it. So there's a lot of space for growth in that area to provide information about the topic. Many people are concerned, 61% of the population, but their level of knowledge on the topic is still quite low. About the importance of global warming. Here we show responses from 80% of the population that consider the topic very important. It is somewhat related to level of schooling, and in 20 and 21, we observed a slight increase in the population above 65 years of age who are concerned with global warming. Here we can also see there is some association with economic status. So it is a concern among the population in general, but it is associated with economic status and a little bit with the political position. Usually people that have a left trend, but with a good overall distribution in the population. Now, about the degree of concern with the environment and highlighting the political aspect, we observed that 61% of the population are very concerned with the environment. Now, when we consider the left trend, the population with a left trend, it's important to understand how we formulated our questions. We did not ask people to declare their political position, but our basic question was how you position yourself in politics, closer to the center or closer to the left or closer to the right. That is how we put it. So the concern is highest among those who are to the left compared to those who have a right-wing trend. But still, half of the population with a right-wing trend also is concerned with the environment. So it's quite high among the right wing also. There is another important association regarding concern with global warming and climate change, which is internet access. In this aspect, I would like to remind you that we are speaking about a population that does acquire a lot of information using digital media. So the concern among the people without internet access is not as high as the others. So 21% say they know a lot about global warming and climate change. But when we consider the population without internet access, that number goes down to 11%. Here we see several indicators, economic status to the left and schooling to the right, people with and without internet access or access to mobile phones. And the same indicator also includes a difference that was observed between economic status and schooling level. So we had 21% of the population that was highly concerned, or rather that has a high knowledge on climate change and global warming. Among A and B classes, this goes up to 20% and 39% for those with higher education. So knowledge is tightly related to economic status and higher schooling. Here we presented to our respondents a trade-off between the environment and economic growth. 77% of the population believe it's more important to protect the environment, even if it means less economic growth and jobs. So they are not in contradiction about defending the environment. They do not see this contradiction between economic growth and increased jobs. They understand that it is possible for the country to grow economically, socially, and still protect its environment. About global warming, more specifically, there is an important point here that I'm sure Tony will touch upon and compare with the reality in the USA. 96% of Brazilians believe that global warming is already happening. So we do not have a problem with denial in this aspect. A very high number, 77%, also believe that global warming is caused by human action, 11% by natural changes, and 11% think that it is one of the causes. So they do have the perception that global warming is already happened, happening and that human action is the most responsible for it. Now, about the opinion of scientists and experts, we see that most of the population, 76%, believes that most scientists think that global warming is already happening. So they believe that there is a consensus in science about global warming. 18% disagree. They believe that there is disagreement among scientists. So their position is quite controversial, that there is a lot of controversy in science, that some scientists defend that there is global warming and others that there is not. But among those who say that there is no global warming, that's only 5% of the population, which is also very important data, which brings us closer to the perception in the USA. The higher the schooling level, the greater the perception that scientists agree on global warming. 70%, 80% of classes A and B, and 70% of economic classes D and E have this perception. Also, among those who have no internet access, they believe that there is this consensus, and 14% against 5% of the total population without internet access believes that there is no scientific evidence and that the scientists do not agree that global warming is happening. So we consider that access to a few channels of information also impacts this perception or this attitude. About the possibility of global warming damaging future generations. So future generations, our children, our grandchildren, 90% of the population agrees that global warming may impact future generations very strongly. 75% believe that global warming can damage their own generation and their family, so it is an immediate harm. It's a very high number, 3 out of every 4 people. So this is an actual concern. And in order to solve climate change issues, most of them believe that the government is responsible, and that is divided between government and corporations, government with 37% and corporations with 32% of the responsibility. And others believe, 24% believe that citizens can also help. Now, comparing those who believe that the government or citizens are responsible for solving the problems, we see that those with a left-wing trend mention the government as the most responsible. These differences may be small, but taking them jointly, we do notice some relationship with their political position. But we will learn a lot about this during our discussion later on. Now, about actual attitudes concerning the environment, we asked about a more theoretical questions or practical questions about sharing information about defending the environment, but also some more practical attitudes and behaviors, such as recycling their own waste. 75% of the population does separate their waste for recycling. Here, we do not know what kind of destination is given to this waste, if the cities or local government provide actual recycling, but the attitude of the population to separate their waste is a very important behavior, and 75% of the Brazilian population is engaging, so it's very important. about sharing information. And here, social media is very important as a source of information. As you can see, 69% of the population does share information about the topic. And when we consider other attitudes and behaviors, the more practical ones, we begin to see that some of them are related to their political position. So while many people are concerned and consider the topic important, only 17% of the population has already participated in any demonstration or signed lists on actions against climate change. 25% have made some kind of donation, and an important observation about this year, because it's a year of elections, 45% of them answered that they have chosen their political candidates because of their position regarding the environment. So 45% of the population does consider this when they are choosing their political candidates. Another important point is that more than half of the population say that they have already stopped purchasing products that damage the environment. So we have both corporations that are interested and engaged in disseminating that their products do not hurt the environment, but the whole market is developing towards a more constant form of consuming habits, consumption habits. And here, about the use of solar energy and other forms of energy, we know that this is only 10% of the population that has started to use some kind of alternative form of energy. Now, highlighting that 45% of the population has already chosen their candidates for political functions because of their position towards the environment. Most of the population, the respondents here, are left-wing and have higher education or are younger. And the 17% is still about the 45% against the 17%. Now, a topic that is very hot in our press for the last years, we touched upon the wildfires in the Amazon forest. 98% have heard about it, so a unanimous perception about the wildfires, and 87% have heard about the wildfires that happen every year around the country, independent from them being in the Amazon or not. 75% of the population believes that the wildfires in the Amazon were caused by human action, and 79% believe that the wildfires have become greater compared to previous years. We also asked this in 2020, and 83% of the population responded that the wildfires were growing. So every year we notice that the population does observe the problem with the wildfires. About its association with politics, 91% of the left-wingers believe that the wildfires in the Amazon have grown, while 68% of the right-wings believe the same. This is a very important difference that we found regarding their political trend. Now, about the responsibility for the wildfires, 76% of the population, and one detail here is that people were given the opportunity to mention three most responsible agents for the wildfire, first, second, and third place. 76% of the population said that the top responsible were lumberers, 50% farmers, 49% cattle raisers and livestock, and 43% miners. So these are the economic activities associated to wildfires. But another important aspect of the poll is that 38% of the population say that the politicians are responsible for the wildfires in the Amazon. Now, this brings a lot of points related to regulation and inspection or surveillance that would be the responsibility of politicians and the government. And the research shows the importance that the population gives to different levels of government contributing to the problem. So the question was about who would contribute the most. 50% of the population answered that the government in all its 3 levels were responsible. For 21%, the citizens are responsible, and for 13%, it's the corporations and industries. So the government is found to have a very important role in the topic, and that they should, and that this shows that this topic will be very important in the political elections this year. Here we see a combination of the same indicator, including schooling level and political stance. So this shows that still the government is considered the most responsible among those with higher schooling, and also more among the left wing than the right wing. 86% agree that the wildfires hurt Brazil's reputation abroad, and that is also heavier among the left wing, and 78% agree that the wildfires can even hurt Brazil's commercial relations, trade relations with other countries, so that Brazil's image is damaged globally because of this problem. Finally, the poll also shows us that 74% disagree that the wildfires in the Amazon are necessary for our economy to grow. So they do not see any relationship with wildfires and economic growth. So when they say that economic activities are responsible for wildfires, what we understand in this response is that it's not justified that any economic activity should cause wildfires or be benefited by them in any way. This was very important in terms of the perception. So I have run out of time, but I will be available to answer your questions. Thank you. Thank you, Rosie, for your presentation. We will now hear Sergio Abrantes, a sociologist, writer, and commentator on CBN radio for a long time. Thank you, Fabro. Good morning to all of our participants. First of all, I will begin with an observation about the consensus among Brazilian society regarding this topic. Rosie also mentioned this. Brazilian society is relatively well informed on the problem, but they do not know very much. That is, they do not need any further convincing. What they do lack is information, practical, concrete information about how you can solve the problem, how the government and the industry and citizens can contribute to climate dangers. Now, the consensus, in spite of small fluctuations that she showed regarding political stance, schooling level, and economic status and age, they don't really make so much of a difference. It is a consensus among Brazil's population that most are simply not concerned. That is, they know the basic information, but they do require more precise and complete information, and information in digital format in the social media that they use. So this is the overall point. I would like to focus on a comment about the survey regarding the history of our Brazilian society. Our society has always been divided in two parts. Analysts and experts use different metaphors and forms of showing that, but we do have one part that is lagging behind, both socially and with regards to values, ideas, and political perceptions. And the other part is always up to date and in sync with what is going on in the rest of the world that is more advanced. So Brazil has always been like that. But there have been some changes brought about by digitalization and other structural changes that are going on globally and that impact our way of life. And digitalization is at the basis of all of this. So this separation of the two parts is no longer so clear in some areas. People with low economic status have been forced to use at least a mobile phone and to have some internet access, or else they simply cannot exist or position themselves in this new society. And this research shows this exactly. That is, when we look at the pattern of responses in Brazil, it's not very different from what we find in opinion surveys in Europe on climate change. And this is funny because sociologists always said that a society like Brazil, very fluid with inequalities that are both structural and linked to mobility within society, that this makes population be more concerned with material needs, and this reduces their focus on the post-materialistic things, that is, what comes after you get the basic development. Values shown in this survey are part of the non-materialistic agenda, and therefore this knowledge and conscience that the fight against climate change are not incompatible with economic growth is very important. And also about what we can do to save the Amazon, that it will not hurt our society economically. So in fact, there has been a change in the Brazilian population's agenda. And my last point is how this change in the social aspect among Brazilian society, how is it reflected politically? It is, as Rosie showed, 45% of the population has chosen their candidates based on their environmental proposals. But on the other hand, this is also closely linked with the materialistic concern. I am quite convinced that the next elections in Brazil will be decided by the economy. We were already traumatized by the pandemic and the paralyzation it brought globally with the disruption of the global supply chains. This impacted everybody's life, increased inflation in Brazil and around the world, more strongly in Brazil. And now we have the invasion in Ukraine, which will prolong and extend this crisis in the economy. So this will certainly bring a strong impact in the next elections. But if environment is not sufficient to elect a president or a governor or even a congressman, and in the case of congressmen, it is even greater, any of these, the environment does impact all these positions, although it does not determine the election. And my final comments are that the myths that have been formed around that the fact that environment will not elect a position is false, because actually the population does have this expectation that the environment will have an impact. And this is associated with a relation that's been made between the recent climate events that happen throughout the whole country. We have extended droughts from the south to the north, floods from the north to the south, and this does impact society's understanding these extreme situations. So if we can convey more robust information to the population, it will be an even greater impact. The population behaves in their consumption already choosing products that do not hurt the environment. They bring an impact by separating their waste, and they also bring an impact by voting. So the population has been incorporating the climate agenda in many aspects of their lives. So this is what the research shows us. And it also shows that, on the other hand, the Brazilian press and media has an important role in disseminating consistent information. It has been observed as a great need that the population has. Then we can discuss more in the questions. Thank you. We are already receiving questions from our viewers and participants, and let us now hear Anthony Lazarowicz, director of the Yale Program on climate change communication. And it was very interesting to work jointly in this project. Our impressions when we shared our results, Anthony said that this was already expected. So we have good results. One is that climate change is something that people are thinking about. And secondly, here in Brazil, especially concerning some of the questions that they showed us, that Brazilians are even more concerned than other countries. So Anthony, you have the floor, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. Now, can I get a thumbs up that you can see my screen? Great. All right. Well, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you. And thank you to Rosie and to Fabro and to all of our colleagues at IPEC as well as ITS for this really wonderful partnership that we've had for the past 2 years. So my name's Anthony Lazarowicz. I'm a faculty member at the Yale School of the Environment, where I direct the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. Very quickly, we study how mass societies around the world are responding to climate change. So what do people understand and misunderstand about the causes, consequences, and solutions? How do they perceive the risks? What kinds of policies they support or oppose? And what kinds of behaviors are they engaged in? And then we study this in, of course, many studies in the United States, but in many other countries around the world, including this wonderful partnership that we have with our friends in Brazil. So what I've been asked to do is to try to put these Brazilian results in a little bit of an international context, comparing these results to 2 other international studies that we conducted at pretty much the same time. So these are in-depth studies that we conducted in the United States and in Ireland. So you're going to get a little bit of what Sergio was just saying with a European perspective, as well as comparing to the United States of America. So let's just jump right in. And so what I'm going to do is just show you a few of the survey questions that were very similar in all 3 countries, so we can do a direct, what we would call apples to apples comparison. So to begin, do publics in these 3 countries believe that climate change is happening? Well, as Rosie already described, in Brazil, it's overwhelming. 96% of Brazilians say, yes, global warming is happening. Only 3% say, no, it is not. And you can see that in Ireland, it's a similar proportion. 96% say, yes, of course, climate change is happening. But the United States is really quite different in this situation. It's at 76%. We have been tracking how public opinion in the United States has been changing over the past decade. And I will say this is an all-time high. So 76% is actually really good in the United States, but it's still substantially lower than it is in either Brazil or in Ireland. And note as well that there's still about 12% of Americans who say, no, global warming is not happening at all. Secondly, do people understand that it is mostly caused by human activities? In fact, it's entirely caused by human activities. And what we see is that in Brazil, 77% of Brazilians say, yes, it is caused mainly by human activities, with another 11% who say it's a combination of human activities and natural causes. In Ireland, it's not quite as high on the full understanding that it's caused mostly by human activities. It's 60% in Ireland, but another 33% say that is a combination of human and natural causes. Again, the United States is a little bit of an outlier here, where it's only 60% of the public that understands that it is human caused. And note that you still have about 27% in the United States who think this is just natural. And that's an important misunderstanding, because if climate change is just natural, then many Americans don't understand why we need to take action as human beings to actually do something about it, to reduce carbon pollution, for example. So that is still an important misunderstanding in the United States, much more so than in Brazil. As Rosie also talked about, the perception of the scientific consensus is quite different in these different countries. Brazil, 76% say that, yes, most scientists think global warming is happening. And in fact, multiple studies have been conducted on this over the years, and they all say that 97% or higher of climate scientists are convinced that global warming is happening and human caused. I mean, there really is no scientific debate about those fundamentals. And by and large, the Brazilians overwhelmingly accept that basic consensus. Likewise, in Ireland, 82% understand that most scientists think global warming is happening. But in the United States, again, it is a majority, and an all-time high, but it's substantially lower than you would see in Brazil. Worry levels, of course, are also very different. And this, I think, is really interesting, because here's where we're starting to get into how people perceive the threat. How dangerous is climate change? And what we find is that in Brazil, 61% of Brazilians say that they're very worried about this issue, with another 26% saying that they're somewhat worried. That's 87%, nearly 9 out of 10 people in the country. By contrast, you can see both in the United States and in Ireland, only about 35 to 37% are very worried about climate change. And this actually relates to a long-standing pattern that we've seen in the United States and in other, especially developed countries around the world, so especially like Europe, the United States, et cetera, is that many people in the public, even those that accept that climate change is real, often think of it as a distant problem. Distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, or distant in space. This is about polar bears, or maybe developing countries in Africa, but not my country, not my city, not my community, not my friends, not my family, and not me. And so for many people, especially in the richer countries, they tend to see this as a psychologically distant problem, not something that connects directly to their lives. And they may generally care about it, but it's a relative abstraction for them. And this, here I will show just two more findings that really relate to this. So Rosie also mentioned this fact that 90% of Brazilians say that global warming will harm future generations. So again, a generation or more away. Overwhelmingly say, yes, global warming will be very harmful to future generations. And likewise in Ireland, 85% say that as well. Again, the United States is quite a bit of an outlier. Only 58% say that it will harm future generations. But by contrast, the perception that global warming will harm you personally is very different. Now, first of all, you can see that in Brazil, our number on this was 75%. It's important to remember that in Brazil, the question was slightly different. In the United States and Ireland, the question was, will it harm you personally? In Brazil, it was a little bit wider to say you personally or your family. But even so, this is a dramatic difference. Okay, Brazilians are far more likely to see that global warming will affect them personally and their family at 75% versus the 21 and 16% in the United States or Ireland. And this really does play then into people's support for action, because when people see that climate change is happening here, that is happening now, and that it is affecting our lives, of course, going back to what Sergio was saying, this is not just a post-materialist issue. This is now a very materialist issue. The very fact that the droughts that Brazil has gone through, record-setting droughts, the terrible floods that have happened in the north, the increasing wildfires and smoke that in fact has blanketed some of your largest cities. These are real. These are very material. People are dying. People are being sick, are made sick, and it is already having very devastating consequences, not just on the natural world, but on the economy, on people's health, on Brazilian society at large. As these impacts become to hit home, we would expect, just as we've already seen, there's overwhelming support for government action on this and that they hold politicians accountable. And the last thing I'll just say is back to the politics, and I am not an expert in Brazilian politics, but compared to the United States, it is remarkable to see how strong the consensus is across political parties, across political ideology in Brazil. In the United States, this issue is far more politically polarized, with one party, the Democrats, taking this issue very, very seriously, and much more like Brazilians in this sense, as well as Europeans. Whereas another party, the right-leaning party, the Republican Party, are still very much less concerned about climate change at all. We don't see that same kind of political polarization in Brazil. And you have one of the biggest, most historic and globally historic elections about to happen in just 7 months. It will literally determine the future of Brazil. It will almost certainly determine the future of much of your natural environment, including the future of the Amazon. And Brazilians will be going to the polls and making truly historic decisions in just a few months. And climate change will be at least one of the issues that will be on their mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's astonishing how numbers can differ from one country and another, and how sometimes it's the opposite. Gente, acabei que fui para o inglês porque eu estava estudando inglês. Só agradecer aqui o Tony.
Going back to Portuguese, I was thanking Anthony, and it's very interesting how there are overwhelming differences between the countries, especially as we saw in the last slide, and also how many of the answers are so equal. We have received some questions from participants. I have forwarded them to Rosie and to Sergio. We still haven't received any questions for Tony yet. So let's begin with Rosie, and you can pick the order of the questions. I will begin with one question that was for me specifically. Jessica asked me to compare the responsibility between politicians and corporations and the industry. So the comparison I made between government and citizens concerning their political stance, but under population, there is a division between the idea that governments and corporations are responsible. So 30%, 37% thought the government was responsible, and 30% corporations and the industry, and 24% citizens are responsible. So this was the direct question for me, and let's hear Sergio answer the question that was made for him, and then we can come back to the general ones. So Sergio, would you like to answer yours? Well, I will put questions about politics together. They were basically about the impact that this research may have on the elections, and whether that will increase the pressure on the government to protect the Amazon? So my answer is generally yes. I have no doubt whatsoever that the climate agenda, especially after the recent floods in the city of Petropolis that the whole country focused on, we are sure that climate will be a very important agenda in the elections, but there is a lot of pressure also from the Amazon. Many other polls say that the population wants the government to act upon the Amazon to reduce deforestation because they see a close connection between deforestation in the Amazon and the loss of trade and reputation of the country globally. The other point, or the other question, was about Bolsonaro and the media, because with Bolsonaro, the media has been providing more information about the environment and what is lacking. I believe that basically, with very rare exceptions, the media informs about disasters and events, but not about ways to improve. There is very little information, for example, about the Amazon 4.0 program or project, which is intended to develop the Amazon population socially and economically. So such programs are not disseminated by the press. So when we discuss what to do, alternatives, what the government can do to enable the solutions, then we go into the political sphere, and that enables electors and voters to compare more strongly the candidates that defend this agenda and their concerns. And one short comment about the data presented by Professor Leizerowitz. And this has to do with what he mentioned, a more material issue that happens in people's lives. And Brazil society is, of course, much poorer than USA or Ireland, meaning that most of the Brazilian population is more vulnerable to extreme disasters or climate events. So they are actually concerned because they know that if they happen, they will be the victims. And therefore, certainly from now on, this agenda will be permanently present in Brazil's political electoral agendas. Thank you, Sergio. Anthony, we didn't get any specific questions for you, but I would like you to comment on any case or any topic that you would like to, maybe focusing on the comment you made that people see a very direct impact on their families. Recently in Brazil, in the last 2 years maybe, we had a series of climate events that are not exactly global warming, but which did impact families. One was a problem with water. We had rationing in many capital cities. The second one is wildfires that cause breath or respiratory problems. We had a very big flood in one of our mountain cities, Petropolis, and therefore I would like to leave you to comment freely on this.
And I'm also saying there's some other questions here as well. So, but look, this all comes down to the fact that while climate change has long been described in global discourse as a distant problem, okay? I mean, we literally talk about it as global climate change. And yet the reality of climate change is intensely always local. And that is going to impact different people, different places at different times in very different ways. And unfortunately, the world has basically squandered the past 30 years of not taking this issue seriously enough And to quote an old statement, the best time to plant a tree is 30 years ago. The second best time is to plant one today. And I think that's basically where we are. The fact is that climate change is no longer hypothetical. It's no longer theoretical. It's here. It's now. It's already affecting Brazilians. It's already affecting Americans. It's already affecting the Irish. It's affecting people everywhere. And I really want to underscore the importance of what Sergio said, is that, of course, not everyone is equally vulnerable. There are huge disparities across the world and within our countries because of economics, because of income, because of education, because of social status, because of social capital, one's ability to recover because you have friends and family that can help you recover from a disaster. These are hugely different, and it's these social dimensions that are going to be dramatically important in who gets hurt first and worst. And unfortunately, it's typically the poor and the most marginalized who will and are already being impacted most, and not just by climate change, but by the fossil fuel industry itself. Because the mining, the drilling, the transportation, the refining, and then the ultimate use of those fossil fuels produces air pollution, for example, that mostly affects people who are living in the most marginal places where these facilities get built. And we haven't even gotten to climate change yet. So it's just say this is part of a much larger system where the world is still predominantly dependent on fossil fuels that are basically now causing major challenges for the entire planet. So just to say, I think Sergio is exactly right. This issue is not a one-time issue. It's not going away. It's only going to intensify, because the fact is, and the sad fact is that the impacts are going to get worse in the next few years before they get better.
Anthony, obrigado pelas respostas.
Thank you, Anthony, for your answers. And while I said there were no questions, we just received 7 questions for you. So we're sorting them. And I would like to ask Renata if you have any special comments, since we're coming close to the end of our session. And meanwhile, I will give you the floor while we are sorting this out. To Rosi. Yes, there was a question about the generational aspect, the differences that are observed between generations. There are some points that can be further developed, and they will be made public regarding the importance of the environment and climate issue. The difference between generations is a problem that most of the population does perceive, irrespective of age. But with regards to this concern, we see a slight difference. Among the younger generation, a smaller portion expresses greater concern compared to the older ones. And therefore, they are close in their degrees of concern, but we do see a slight difference among the younger population. Well, that is actually natural from teenagers to think in the shorter term and not to be so much influenced by the longer term. And as we grow and mature, this perception is developed and sharpened that the problem does exist and that we need more long-term actions with regards to the environment. Sergio, do you have any comments? No. Well, one final remark about what Anthony mentioned concerning the impact that it will grow worse, and about what I said that we need to point out solutions. I went to a meeting in the Amazon with some local communities to talk about climate change. indigenous quilombolas and other communities. And they are perfectly aware that global change, climate change is happening, that it is already affecting their lives, that the rain seasons are different, that the fisheries, fish's habits are different. They know of all that, but they don't know what to do, how to do, and who will save the situation, because for that, it's their existence. If the environment ends, their lives will end. For the indigenous people, even their cosmology, for their entities, the forest is a part of paradise. And when you die, you go to an even more pristine forest. But if the forest here disappears, their heaven will also disappear. So the impact changes among the different groups, but it's stronger when you have a greater social vulnerability. So that is why it's so important for us to disseminate more information and practical content about what to do and those who should be accountable. Thank you, Sergio. Tony, we have posted some more questions. Some of them are broader, some of them are a little bit out of the scopus. So I would like to invite you for your final remarks. If you wish to address any of the questions, feel free.
Sure. Well, I see several questions in here about climate denial. And I think there's a few things that come back to what another critical issue that we've been talking about is the importance of digital media in today's age. Cell phones are now everywhere. Internet access is increasingly available everywhere. And as Sergio mentioned, this is changing Brazilian society. It is in some ways leveling Brazilian societies. In other ways, these technologies can be used to communicate very specific pieces of information or misinformation to very specific audiences. And we have seen a number of examples in the recent few years of powerful political interests using those same technologies to communicate misinformation or even disinformation, attempting to blame indigenous people or blame environmental NGOs or blame celebrities from other countries for the fires in the Amazon, for example. The good news in this survey is that the great majority of Brazilians do not buy those claims and those arguments. It's just amazing how little climate denial we find in Brazil. So I think the broader point is that while those may be very effective with very specific targeted audiences, they have not had an impact on the entire society. And I'll just close with really trying to underscore Sergio's most important point, is that the conversation, the discourse in Brazil is no longer about, is this real? Or is it human caused? Or is it even a serious problem for Brazil? Those are done. People understand that. The big question now is, what do we do about it? And I think that really is incumbent upon the entire community, from political leaders to business leaders to NGOs to all of civil society, is to roll up their sleeves and get involved with this crucial set of questions. And there's no one answer to it. This is about changing everything we do in order to live more sustainably. And that means everything from our energy, our food practices, our agricultural practices, our consumption practices, et cetera. That's really the challenge. And Brazil is in this way more advanced than the United States. We are still have an ongoing discussion about how serious climate change is. And we're struggling to actually pass the legislation to actually take real action. And we're close. But in Brazil, in that sense, your public discourse, your public consciousness, your public understanding is more advanced than in the United States and in many other developed countries around the world. So I think that really does raise the question to all politicians: what is your plan? What are you proposing to do? And the last thing I'll just say is that given the consensus across political party, across political ideology in Brazil, This is a huge opportunity for every single politician running for office this year. This is a huge voting block, and it's not partisan. You can appeal beyond your own political base by coming up with a strong action plan. In fact, a stronger action plan than your opponents. So this is at least the political conditions for what we would call a race to the top. Who can have the best plan?
Muito obrigado pela conclusão. Eu vou fazer encerramento.
Thank you for your final comments. And in my closing, two important messages. One is our link to our website or to our research site. You will see all the information. You can match and compare and cross. And IPEC's website also includes a lot of information, and you will also find what we did with our beneficiaries last year concerning our studies, and we hope that we match the great interest we had last year. We actually had to double the number of vacancies for beneficiaries. And finally, when we look at the topics, climate perception comes in 9th and 10th, but when we look at the first three topics, job, health, there is a very close relationship with climate change. And Tony showed us that if there is this transpartisan consensus, and if you have the big support from all of society, the problem, and maybe the last person who had a strong identity with a climate agenda was Mariana Silva, but since her, we haven't seen this strong connection. So maybe we do see greater opportunities for the next elections. Thank you to all who participated in our session. We are at your total available for any future discussions. And I would also like to thank all of the climate organizations that participated for their support and participation, and especially Yale and IPEC. Thank you very much.